Okay, so here we are at the Open Weather Map API. We're going to look at how do we read and understand API documentation. So on their main page, they're showing you here are the main kind of things that they can do. So there's actually a whole bunch of things on here. We've been working with the forecast data, and so we can click on API doc, and that's going to take us to more detail on sort of what we get, how we make the calls, and so on. Most API pages are going to look like this. So they may not be formatted in this way, but they're going to have these sorts of data. So it starts generally with like a title and description about what it actually is. And then they've got API call down here. API call is going to be the URL that you use to actually access that. They have an example down here. This looks a lot like what we were doing. So api.openweathermap.org/data/2.5/forecast $Q equals London, US, and mode equals XML. So you can actually click on that URL here and get a forecast. And you can see that it's just that URL plus an app ID appended to the end. And then they go through a bunch of different ways that you can call it. So you can put in city IDs, geographic coordinates, zip codes, and then there's some rules about how to bulk download things. And then they show you the formats of the response. So that's what's it going to look like if you go ahead and make this call. So this is the JSON formatted response. JSON is a little bit more human readable than XML, and it's a little more compact, so it's really common to see this format. And then they tell you what are all of the parameters that come back, and what do they mean, and what are the parts. Same thing for XML. This is what we've been working with. Here's that same data in XML format. And again, here are all of the parameters and the parts that come back with that. So the really useful thing in here is that it starts off by telling you here's what this does, and then here's how you actually put the URL together to make a call. Not all documentation has an example where you can click and see a result. Some of them do it like this, where you can click and it'll actually show you a result in a window. Some of them have it sort of internally simulated, so there will be like a frame and you can click the link and see the results shown there. But not all of them do. They will all, however, have an example of what does the format look like. The question mark is always what separates kind of the API endpoint, essentially the function that the API is providing, from the arguments. The arguments come afterwards. They're name value pairs separated by an ampersand, and that's because of the way that URLs are structured. This is used not just in APIs, but all over the place in URLs. The question mark means that you're going to have a bunch of name value pairs separated by ampersands coming as arguments. And so API documentation will show you how to do that. So as a contrast, let's take a look at the Twitter API. So let's look at some documentation here. So let's do get tweet timelines. Okay, so this is, it's not structured in the same way, but it kind of starts in the same way as we saw on the Open Weather Map, where you've got, here's a bunch of stuff that we can do. Once we get down here, we're able to see, all right, for getting tweet timelines, here's the API endpoints, essentially the URLs that we're going to access to get this. So let's do user timeline. So it gives us a little description of what this is. So this is going to get a user's tweets. Here's the URL. This is the URL that you're going to put in to get that data. Now this doesn't have any of the arguments on it, but it shows you what's the URL that you're going to use. If we were to just try to put that in right now, we get an error because we don't have an API key provided. So that's okay. And then they give you some information about what do you get. But more importantly, here are the parameters. These are the arguments, the inputs, the things you would put after the question mark. So user ID, what's the ID of the person that you're going to get the results for? Here's an example. You can also do a screen name. It tells you if these are optional or required. And here's an example of a request. So get means you're going to get that URL just like we've been doing in our code. And you can see here we've got the same URL that was above, and then finally the question mark, screen name equals Twitter API account equals 2. And these arguments are all explained up here. This probably won't work if we just put it in because Twitter is very strong with requiring authentication to use the API. They actually require much stronger authentication than just the user key like we were able to do in the open weather map, which is part of why we're not using it. But they do show you an example response. Here's the format of the data. This is in JSON format. And so you can see everything that gets returned there. So even though the layout's a little bit different, essentially the format is the same. And this is true for pretty much all REST APIs, that they're going to give you the general URL that you call. They're going to tell you the parameters or the arguments that you pass in after the question mark. They're going to give you an example of how that's formatted. And if you're lucky, they also give you an example of the response and what that looks like. So being able to read and understand these APIs, it'll take you a little bit of time to get used to it, but just know that you're looking essentially for this kind of format, that some of them will require authentication in different ways, which is something that we'll get used to as we go through examples. But essentially, you're just going to construct the URL that you want. You're going to get that from within your script, and then it's going to give you back a response that's formatted like the examples show, and your job is going to be to process that out. We're going to stick with XML for the examples today because that's something that we've been doing, but Python is also perfectly capable of parsing JSON for you in the same way. So essentially, you'll look at a JSON parser, but it's going to give you the same way to kind of iterate through elements because the data is structured in the same way with JSON as it is with XML.